All right, the second theory that accounts for why you feel attracted to people is social exchange theory. And this is built on like an economic theory. And so social exchange theory views exchange, right, giving and taking, as a social behavior that may result in both economic and social outcomes. I don't like this theory because it compares your behavior to like the marketplace, which I think is problematic for a number of reasons. But the reason I do like the theory is because we often think that romance is very mystical and why we're attracted to people is very unpredictable and, oh, I have to stay with this person because we're destined to be together. And it is helpful, I think, to think about your relationship in economic terms because sometimes, for example, you have to make a decision about whether you should leave a relationship in which you're not happy. And this is a way for you to understand what some of those factors might be influencing your happiness. Likewise, many of us, I'm sure, have given up really great relationships because we expected them to be something more. And that's because we didn't understand that the relationship is, it's a social exchange cost benefit issue. And so our expectations of the relationship were too high. And then, of course, years later, we realized that we should have had a better understanding of what we had when we had it. So there's a couple of components of social exchange theory. And essentially, the theory predicts that you are going to be most satisfied in relationships that, one, your rewards or benefits outweigh your costs, right? That makes sense. You're getting more than you're putting in. Two, the relationships meets your expectations as established by comparison levels. So your expectations are created by how you compare your relationship and your relational partner to other relational partners you've had, or like your friend's relational partner or whatever. And so you're going to be happiest in relationships that meet those comparison levels. Three, you'll be happiest in relationships if your relationship and your partner is better than the alternatives that you have available. So for example, one reason why people stay in relationships that we would think of as bad relationships where the costs outweigh the rewards, or like the relationship, like you could do so much better, like your parents had a great relationship or your friends all have great relationships, why aren't you in a great relationship? Well, sometimes the issue is that people don't have a lot of alternatives. And so you might be in an unhappy relationship on the other two factors, but that third factor, the comparison to alternatives, is really good because you don't have a lot of alternatives, or the alternatives are all like bad, like all the good ones are taken kind of thing. So you stay in the relationship. And then the fourth is that you perceive there to be equity with yourself and your partner. So equity is just the balance between your inputs and outcomes. And so you have to believe like you and your partner both have equity. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you make the same amount of money or you're both very funny. In fact, sometimes the best equity in a relationship is when the partner brings things to the table that you don't necessarily have. So I was listening earlier to a person, it was a woman, who was complaining, and she's in a heterosexual relationship. And so she was complaining that she makes a lot more money than her husband, and she kind of doesn't think that that's right. And she wants him to make as much money as her, and she works in a very highly competitive industry where all the men have all this money, and so it makes her feel like there's no equity, right? Because she's bringing all the money, and the husband's bringing in no money, so there's no equity, right? And then someone said, well, like, how did this happen? Like, if you didn't want this, like, how did it come about? And she was like, oh, well, I agreed that because I'm so good at making money and I have a great career that I would be the primary money maker, and that he would take a part-time job teaching instead of a really highly well-paid, highly stressful job, because he wanted to have time to raise our children and kind of like keep the house going and take care of all of that like soft labor stuff. And then it's like, well, then there is equity, because all of the stuff that you can't do because you're more of a career person and you're more of a money person and you're more focused on those things, your partner does, right? The emotional labor of the relationship. And so there is equity. But if you're only focused on the money, it looks like there's no equity until you realize that the kinds of things you bring to the table are different than the kinds of the things that your partner brings to the table. But again, these are all perceptions. So if we look at the four factors that influence whether or not you're happy in a relationship, one is that the rewards outweigh the cost. But of course, which rewards you focus on and which costs you focus on and how you measure those is ultimately a choice that you make. The relationship meets your expectations as compared to your previous relationships. So a lot of us will say like, oh, well, in my old relationship, my partner was just so much more loving. It's like, yeah, but you're not in that relationship anymore. So that your partner must have had other problems besides like maybe they were loving, but maybe they also were flighty and poorly organized and bad with money and flighty, right? So don't just remember the good stuff about the alternatives. Remember all of that person, because you get to choose your expectations in a relationship. They're not given to you by previous relationships. You choose the measurement. 3, the relationship is better than alternatives. Well, sure, it's easy to look around and think, oh, I have all these alternatives and all these people would be interested in me and I could date them and I could date them and I could be friends with that person. But that's a grass is always greener kind of situation. So again, you get to control your perception of what those alternatives mean. And finally, equity, right? You can choose how to perceive equity. If you think that the person you're in a relationship with should be exactly like you, you're going to have a hard time finding equity. Also, my hunch is that you'd be miserable because in some ways the best equity is when people bring different qualities to the relationship so that they make up for each other's strengths and weaknesses. But again, you get to choose how you measure a lot of these things. And so even though the theory predicts that these 4 factors will determine whether you're happy or unhappy in a relationship, the measurements through which you measure equity, value, cost, rewards, expectations, etc., are up to you, and you can choose to change those measurements to be happier in your relationship. So being happy in your relationship is ultimately a choice, and that's a good thing because it means if you think the kind of thoughts that lead to good outcomes, you'll be happy. But it also means if you're in a bad relationship that you probably should get out of for objective reasons like they're abusive, you can convince yourself that, oh, but I don't have a good set of alternatives. Or, yeah, but they have all these other things that are good about them, right? So you can talk yourself into staying in a bad relationship.